When I was a kid in the Colorado Rockies, I was taking my horse and the whole band of dogs we had, two labs and Ozzy and a dachshund, to our pond by my grandparents' place. I decided it was a great idea to venture the back way through the thicker part of the pine forest. I knew the way, and so did the animals, horse included. Around 5 minutes from the house, I was oblivious to the world and didn't really notice that the dogs were no longer with me. When I finally decided to come back to the real world and noticed the dogs missing, I turned back since you don't go anywhere without them. They were basically my guardians and supervisors up there at that time. I get about halfway back to the house, come up to a small gully heavily filled with pines, and there's this huge cougar just staring at me right in the middle of the path. I was 8 years old at the time, a little guy, and a tasty morsel for this kind of animal. Luckily, I had the horse, who, upon seeing the animal, immediately bolted directly back to the pasture. The cat seemed to run after us. I didn't really watch. We roll up into our long, winding driveway, head towards the pasture, and I agree that this ends my adventures for the day. After I put the horse up, the dogs finally find me again. We are walking back to the house when they get real jumpy and quite timid. I stop and begin to look around. There is a large and old pine that was splitting the distance between the pasture and the house, and on the lowest branch, I see that damn cougar again. Luckily, the presence of the dogs deterred any action from it, but I made it a point to pass far away from the tree, and as calmly as I can, I tell my grandpa what had happened. He goes outside, rifle in hand, and never found the bastard. To this day, I never venture out without my dogs or my weapon, just in case. So my father is a forestry technician, and this happened to one of his coworkers. They are up doing some sort of job in the very most northerly part of Ontario. Anyways, it was in the middle of the night and she was half asleep and vaguely heard something outside of her tent. Then she felt something push against the tent and the zipper slowly start to open. She opened her eyes and saw the head of a frickin' polar bear inside of her tent. Polar bears are the farthest thing from the cuddly toys that you see, and they are known to be super hyper aggressive and will hunt and even eat people. She laid there, paralyzed with fear, thinking that it was the end, but slowly the bear retracted its head and simply left. So I was technically a ranger at Yosemite and passed every day through the gate along the Merced River. One day, there was a commotion which caused a slowdown, but didn't involve us, so we just crept on by, just slow enough to hear a man in anguish trying loudly to explain something. It was early summer, but the river was still raging from a solid snowpack that year, and we later found out that the guy was trying to take a picture of his wife with the torrent in the backdrop. Apparently, he kept telling her to back up just a little bit further when she just fell off the edge. Us and the firefighting guys were tasked with finding her body. Nobody made much of a pretense that she might have actually survived. We ended up finding her 2 months later, after the river had settled enough that we'd start swimming in it, just upstream from our swimming hole. Her body was just a mess, from presumably being underwater for 2 months, but also being smashed over and over against the rocks in the whirlpool-like currents. I bet that man is going to feel guilty for the rest of his life. So my father spoke to a Chinese woman who lived as a forest survey person up in the mountains for the past 30 or so years. This was up in Canada about 5 years ago, as an unofficial sort of person the government would like to ask regarding forest fires, any sort of illegal activity, poaching, etc. She had said that she had spotted multiple Sasquatches during her time up there, and that they are very quite intelligent, and just don't want to interact with people, probably out of fear. Not even the younger ones, but if she's out there, they're pretty chill with her. Something about it being because she had grown up around that area and remember seeing them from a very young age. She had a totally straight look on her face, and my dad said that she was one of the most rational and genuine people he's ever met out there. He owned a strip of gold claim out that way at that time, and she had said that if he knew what was good for him, he would not dig up any of that ground, because disturbing the earth in that area would have very negative consequences. He's not one for superstition, but needless to say, he sold that property years ago. So, during my high school and college summers, I worked for the Pike National Forest in Woodland Park, Colorado. I namely did trail maintenance for ATVers, dirt bikers, hikers, bikers, etc. It was a pretty overall amazing summer job. So this one summer, when I was like 18, we were driving around patrolling on a rainy day when we noticed a car with all of its windows down about 20 feet off the main road. We thought nothing of it at first and simply just headed back. When it was still there the next 2 days after it had been raining all week, we stopped to check it out. On the car's front driver's seat are the keys to the car, a wallet, identification, and a few bucks cash. On the passenger seat was a note. I opened it, and I'll never forget what it said. It read, "Tell me again what it's like to feel anything except being cold." Yeah, we called law enforcement officers out there, and they ended up finding him hung on a branch a few hundred feet away from the car. 12 years later, and it still haunts me sometimes. So I remember this one story I heard a few times as a kid about the woods around my hometown. I still have no idea if it actually happened, but as with all these stories, every kid in my town claims to have knowledge about it. So the story goes that a bunch of kids, 8 to 12-year-olds, were running around some of the woods and stumbled upon a hole in the ground that had been recently dug. The younger kids thought this was great because they could use it to play around with and whatnot. But one of the older kids realized that what they had found was actually a pre-dug grave. Supposedly it was about a meter wide, 2 meters long, and a meter deep as well. So the kids ended up running home to tell their parents, who in turn told the local policeman, who got the kids to lead them to the place. The cops agreed that this is suspicious, but simply doesn't have the resources to stake it out 24/7. So instead, he chooses to leave it as is and come back every day to check on it. Nothing happens for a while until one day the cop checks and finds that the hole is filled in. He brings in a forensics unit and they recover the remains of a young woman known to the policeman, who immediately raced to the home of the woman to find out what had happened. When he and the other cops got there, they found the husband in the middle of disposing incriminating evidence. Those damn kids. I was out backpacking alone one night in the woods, pretty far away from any real civilization, and as far as I know, miles away from any other person. I'd picked a nice spot to pitch my tent and had settled in for the night. I just closed my eyes when, out of nowhere, I hear this blood-curdling cry. It was without a doubt the most terrifying noise I've ever heard. It sounded kind of like a woman screaming, but in a twisted, inhuman way. Kind of like a bobcat, but more visceral. I've heard mountain lions scream before, and this was nothing like it. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent slightly, and looked around, but I didn't see anything. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, heart pounding and waiting for anything to happen. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I heard it only a few more times, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, then suddenly it altogether stopped. I was absolutely certain that I had just heard someone being murdered. I ended up staying the rest of the night there anyways, because I was too afraid to even move or even attempt to hike back to the trailhead. But I don't think I ever managed to get any sleep that night. It wasn't until I got back, after booking it out of there as soon as the sun came up, and was telling the story to a friend of mine, that he asked me if maybe it had been an elk. I'd never known what an elk actually had sounded like, but I looked it up, and sure enough, that was exactly the noise I heard. So, overall, it was a happy ending at least. I actually visited the suicide forest in Japan by myself last year. I was near Mount Fuji anyways, so I figured it wasn't much of a detour. I'd been in there for about 2 hours perfectly comfortably, hadn't even got frightened once. Seen a few things though. Then, at one point, probably the furthest point I'd walked, I came across a sleeping bag under a tarp. One thing to know about this forest is that it's dead silent. There's no sounds of insects or birds. It's just a forest grown on top of ancient lava and the dead roots of previous trees, so there's no ground level really. There are caverns and holes everywhere. It's actually very dangerous to walk in, so I'd approached the sleeping bag when suddenly noticed that it looked like someone was actually in it, and a wave of an awful smell just hit me like a pile of bricks. I panicked a little and turned around to get away from it, but my foot went straight into a rotting root and I got stuck there for about 3 minutes. Not very long, but I was completely freaked out, totally convinced I was feet away from a dead body in this dark, silent forest and unable to get away. Eventually, I got loose and didn't turn back, just marched the hour straight out of the place. The whole walk back, I felt incredibly uneasy. I deleted most of the pictures I had actually taken from that trip, out of the sense of respect, I guess. I don't believe in the supernatural, but that was as close as I'd ever come. Hey guys, it's Gotay here. Thank you so much for listening to this video. I know forests, personally for me, are a pretty big creep factor, and they do a lot to me. I used to visit a friend whose house was right next to a forest, and we'd explore that to our heart's content. And let me tell you, I do have a few stories of my own, but they're all just stupid childhood shit. So, not a lot of scary stories, anyways. But if any of you have any stories of your own you would like to share with me and have me put in future videos, please do not hesitate to send them to me via my personal email linked in the description below, and I'll be sure to include them in one of my next videos. So, with all that out of the way, thank you so much for watching again, and I will see you mates in the next episode.